When a god from another reality stepped into the Star Wars galaxy, he did not come seeking alliance or understanding. He came to conquer, not with armies or fleets, but with something far more terrifying, a vision of absolute order, where every choice, every rebellion, every spark of hope would be mathematically proven meaningless. The Force itself recoiled as Darkseid walked among the stars, his eyes burning with knowledge that could unravel the very fabric of free will. Grand Admiral Thrawn saw a weapon to be wielded. The Sith saw a threat to their dark side dominion. But none of them understood the truth. This was not an invasion. It was the beginning of the end of choice itself. Could anything in a galaxy built on destiny and balance stand against a being who sought to replace the Force with cold, perfect certainty? The unknown regions had always been a place of silence and secrets, a sprawling darkness at the edge of every star chart where hyperspace lanes twisted into labyrinths, and entire civilizations rose and fell without the Republic ever knowing their names. The Chiss ascendancy patrolled these reaches with cold efficiency, their crimson eyes scanning the void for threats that might one day spill into the ordered galaxy. But on the night the sky tore open, no amount of vigilance could have prepared them for what emerged. The fissure appeared without warning, a wound in space itself that bled impossible colors, hues that had no names in any language spoken by living tongues. The rupture expanded across 3 parsecs in the span of a single breath, swallowing starlight and spitting it back twisted. 7 Chiss frigates moved to investigate, their commanders already composing tactical reports in the precise military syntax of their people. They never finished those reports. He came through the wound like a god stepping from one reality into another, his form vast and armored, eyes burning with the red fire of Omega. Darkseid, Lord of Apocalypse, tyrant of the anti-life equation, stood in the void between stars and looked upon this new universe with ancient, pitiless intelligence. The Chiss ships fired immediately, turbo-laser batteries unleashing emerald fury across the black. The bolts struck his chest, his shoulders, his upraised hand. They might as well have been raindrops against a mountain. He raised one gauntleted fist, and the Omega effect burst forth, twin beams of crimson annihilation that curved through space with predatory intent. The first frigate exploded in a sphere of white flame. The second tried to jump to hyperspace and was caught mid-transition, its hull shearing apart across 2 dimensions simultaneously. The third managed to broadcast a single word before it died. The word was not a name or a designation. It was simply, "Run." But there was nowhere to run. Darkseid moved through the debris field, his boots somehow finding purchase on nothing, as though the universe itself had learned to fear him and provided ground, where there should be none. He reached the flagship, a sleek destroyer whose commander stood on the bridge, barking orders in clipped churn. Darkseid looked at the ship, and it crumpled like a child's toy crushed in an iron grip. Metal screamed. Oxygen vented into the void in glittering streams of frozen crystals. Bodies tumbled into the black, their final breaths condensing into ice. He did not watch them die. He was already turning, his gaze sweeping across the starfield, perceiving the patterns of this new cosmos with senses that transcended mere sight. He felt the currents here, the invisible tides that moved between all things. The natives called it the Force, this pale echo of true power. To Darkseid, it was a primitive thing, an unrefined energy waiting to be harnessed and bent to a singular will. His will. Somewhere in the depths of space, alarms began to sound. Sensor stations registered the destruction. Distress beacons burned bright and brief before going silent. And on the bridge of the Chimera, Grand Admiral Thrawn stood before a holographic display showing the coordinates where 7 Chiss vessels had simply ceased to exist, his red eyes narrowed in calculation. The galaxy had just learned a new definition of threat, though it did not yet know the name of what had arrived. That knowledge would come soon enough, written in fire and ash across 100 worlds. Darkseid descended upon the first inhabited system 3 days later, his trajectory calculated with the precision of a god who had conquered 1,000 galaxies and knew the mathematics of domination by heart. The world was called Nesthig, an imperial colony on the outer edge of the unknown regions, its surface dotted with mining operations and garrison bases. 20,000 souls lived and worked beneath its grey skies, their lives measured in quotas and production schedules, their spirits already crushed under the efficient brutality of the Empire. He did not announce himself. He did not issue demands or ultimatums. He simply appeared in the sky above the capital city, a dark figure suspended against the clouds, and when he spoke, his voice rolled across the atmosphere like thunder given syntax. "Submit," he said, and the word carried the weight of inevitability, as though refusal had never been an option the universe allowed. The Imperial garrison commander was a man named Vect, a career officer who had survived the Clone Wars and the purges that followed by knowing when to obey and when to make examples. He looked at the figure in the sky and felt something he had not felt since childhood, before the Academy had trained the weakness out of him. He felt terror, pure and primal, the kind that lived in the hindbrain and remembered when humanity had been prey. Vect ordered every gun emplacement to fire. AT-ATs pivoted their massive heads skyward. Turbo-laser towers swiveled and locked. Stormtroopers raised their rifles in perfect formation. The order was given, and the city erupted in a storm of coherent light and explosive ordnance that turned the sky into a hellscape of crisscrossing fire. Darkseid raised both hands, and the Omega effect answered, twin beams that split and multiplied, curving through the air in geometric impossibilities. They struck the AT-ATs first, reducing the walkers to molten slag. They carved through gun towers like surgical instruments, precise and utterly without mercy. They found stormtroopers in their trenches and turret crews in their bunkers, and they did not kill quickly or cleanly. The Omega effect unmade, breaking matter down to its component atoms and scattering them as ash on the wind. The bombardment lasted 47 seconds. When it ended, the garrison was gone. Smoke rose from 100 craters. Bodies lay in pieces across streets that ran with blood and coolant oil. Vect survived long enough to see his command annihilated, then Darkseid turned his gaze upon the commander, and the man's heart simply stopped, seized by a terror so profound his body could no longer remember how to function. The civilians watched from windows and cellars, their faces pressed against transparent steel, their breath fogging the glass. Darkseid descended slowly, his boots touching the shattered permacrete of the central plaza. He looked at them, these small, fragile things with their small, fragile lives, and he spoke again. "You are slaves," he said. "You have always been slaves. The only difference now is that you know the name of your master." He raised one hand and the air shimmered. A structure began to materialize, rising from the ground like a monument to inevitability. Black stone, geometric and cold, carved with glyphs in a language that hurt to perceive. A temple, a throne, a declaration. One by one, the people of Nestig emerged from their hiding places. They came into the plaza and they knelt, not because they believed, but because their bodies moved without their minds commanding it, compelled by something deeper than thought. Darkseid looked upon them and nodded once, satisfied. The conquest of Nestig took less than an hour. It would serve as the template for 100 more. Grand Admiral Thrawn received the report while standing in his private gallery aboard the Chimera, surrounded by artwork plundered from a dozen civilizations. He read the account of Nestig's fall twice, his expression never changing, then turned to the holographic projection of the world as it now appeared. The Black Temple dominated the capital, visible from orbit, a scar upon the planet's surface. Thrawn was many things: a genius tactician, a collector of cultures, a student of patterns and psychological warfare, but above all, he was a pragmatist. He looked at the data streaming from the unknown regions and saw not a disaster but an opportunity. The Emperor ruled through fear, yes, but fear was a tool that dulled with use. This new arrival, this Darkseid, represented a different kind of terror entirely: raw, absolute, mythic. The question was not whether the being could be defeated. Thrawn had learned long ago that everything could be defeated if one understood its nature deeply enough. The question was whether it was more valuable as an enemy or as a weapon. He composed a message, brief and carefully worded, and transmitted it on an encrypted channel toward Coruscant. The recipient was not the Emperor. The Emperor would learn of this development soon enough through his own channels, through the whispers in the Darkseid that Thrawn neither understood nor trusted. No, this message was for someone else, someone whose existence was known to perhaps a dozen beings in the entire galaxy. The message read simply, "A new player has entered the board. His power is considerable, but his understanding of this galaxy is limited. I believe he can be guided. Recommend immediate contact before the Sith become involved." He sent the message and returned his attention to the artwork surrounding him, a sculpture from Alderaan that depicted the mythical world between worlds, where all moments in time supposedly converged. Thrawn had always found the piece intellectually interesting but dismissed the actual existence of such a place as superstition. Now, looking at it, he wondered if this Darkseid had emerged from something similar, a rupture between realities. The comm on his wrist chimed softly. He activated it and listened to the voice that emerged, distorted by layers of encryption but still recognizable. The voice belonged to a figure the Jedi had believed extinct, a Sith Lord who served neither Emperor nor Vader but who had survived in the shadows since the fall of the Republic, pursuing knowledge the rule of two deemed too dangerous even for its practitioners. Valtor spoke, and his words carried the rasping quality of one who had lived too long in places where the Force grew twisted and strange. "I felt him arrive," the Sith said. "A wound in the Force, a presence that does not belong. He is not of the dark side, Thrawn. He is not of the light. He is something else entirely, something older. The Force itself recoils from him." Thrawn considered this. "Is he a threat to the Empire?" A pause, then a sound that might have been laughter, or might have been something far less pleasant. "He is a threat to existence, Grand Admiral. But threats can be useful, can they not? I will observe. Do nothing to antagonize him until I understand what he wants." Thrawn acknowledged and ended the transmission. He returned to his contemplation of the Alderaanian sculpture, his mind already working through scenarios and contingencies. Outside the viewport, stars burned with indifferent light, unaware that the balance of power in the galaxy had just shifted in ways no military strategist or force wielder had ever anticipated. Darkseid stood atop his temple on Nestig and looked toward the galactic core, perceiving the weight of civilizations layered upon one another like strata in dollars, ancient rock. Trillions of souls, all of them living in the delusion of free will, all of them convinced their choices mattered. It was almost charming in its naivety. He had conquered galaxies before. He had shattered pantheons and broken the wills of gods. This place would be no different, though the process might take longer than usual. The Force, as they called it, was an interesting variable. He had felt it the moment he arrived, a vast network of energy connecting all living things, binding the cosmos in an invisible web. It reminded him of the Source, that fundamental power the new gods of his realm drew upon. But where the Source was neutral, indifferent, the Force seemed to possess something resembling intention, as though the universe itself had opinions. That would need to be corrected. He had learned of the anti-life equation in his youth, that mathematical proof of the meaninglessness of existence, the formula that would give him dominion over all thinking beings by stripping away their capacity for hope. He had spent eons searching for it, come close a dozen times, been thwarted by heroes and chance and his own miscalculations. But now, standing in a new reality, he felt something stirring, a resonance, a possibility. The Force was not the anti-life equation, but it might contain the key to completing it. If he could understand this energy, decode its fundamental nature, bend it to his will, then he would possess something no other being in any reality had ever achieved. Total dominion, not just over bodies but over souls, over the very concept of self. His musings were interrupted by a disturbance in the air before him. Space folded and a figure materialized, stepping from nothing into sudden existence. Humanoid, robed in black that seemed to drink the light, face hidden behind a mask of ancient design. The newcomer's presence carried weight in the Force, a darkness so profound it was almost tangible. Valtor inclined his head, a gesture that might have been respect or might have been mockery. "I greet you, traveler from beyond. I am called Valtor, and I have walked the shadows of this galaxy since before the Empire rose. You intrigue me." Darkseid regarded the Sith with the same expression he might give a particularly interesting insect. "You wield the Force," he said, his voice a deep rumble that made the air vibrate. "Show me." Valtor smiled beneath his mask, or at least his voice suggested a smile. "As you wish." The Sith raised one hand and lightning erupted, blue-white and crackling, lancing across the space between them. It struck Darkseid's chest, and he stood unmoved, his armor absorbing the energy without apparent effort. Valtor's smile faded. He gestured sharply, and the stones of the temple began to rise, dozens of them, tons of black rock levitating and then hurling forward like missiles. Darkseid swatted them aside with casual waves of his hand, the Omega effect reducing several to dust mid-flight. The Sith tried precognition, reaching into the future to anticipate his opponent's next move. But what he perceived made him stagger. The future was a wall of fire, a certainty so absolute it admitted no other possibilities. He tried to peer into Darkseid's past and found only an abyss that looked back. Valtor lowered his hand and collected himself, his breathing steady despite the shock of what he had just encountered. "You are powerful," he admitted, "more powerful than anything I have faced. But power alone does not make one invincible in this galaxy. The Force has a will of its own, and it does not take kindly to those who seek to dominate it absolutely." Darkseid descended from his throne, each step making the temple shudder. "The Force," he said, "is a tool. All things are tools. Some simply require more effort to master. You will tell me everything you know of this energy, its origins, its limits, its secrets. In return, I will allow you to witness the remaking of reality." Valtor felt the weight of that command, felt the absolute confidence behind it. He had served the dark side for decades, had committed atrocities that would make even Vader pause, but this being before him represented something beyond the dichotomy of light and dark. It was a void unto itself, a singularity of will. The Sith made a choice, the kind of choice that defines a being's place in history. He knelt, slowly, his robes pooling around him. "I will share what I know," he said quietly. "But there are places even I dare not tread, secrets guarded by powers older than the Sith. If you truly wish to master the Force, you must go to the Mortis gods, to the realm where the light, the dark, and the balance converge. It is said that realm exists outside normal space, in a place called the World Between Worlds." Darkseid's eyes blazed brighter. "Show me the way." The journey to Mortis required preparation that tested even Darkseid's patience. Valtor explained that the realm could not be reached through conventional, hyperspace travel. It existed in a pocket dimension, accessible only through specific Force vergences scattered across the galaxy. The nearest was in the deep core, on a world whose name had been stricken from all records after the Jedi Purge. They traveled in silence, Darkseid, requiring no ship but simply moving through space by will alone, his form encased in a sphere of dark energy that bent physics to accommodate his passage. Valtor followed in a modified Sith infiltrator, its cloaking systems hiding their approach from Imperial sensors. It took 4 days to reach the Vergence. 4 days during which the Sith compiled everything he knew about the Force's metaphysical structure, preparing for what he suspected would be either the greatest discovery of his life or its end. The Vergence world was dead, its surface scoured by ancient weapons, its atmosphere long since boiled away. But deep beneath the crust, in chambers carved by forgotten civilizations, the Force pooled like water in a well. Valtor led Darkseid down, through kilometers of rock, until they stood in a vast cavern whose walls were covered in glyphs that predated the Old Republic by millennia. At the center of the cavern was a doorway, an arch of pure light that flickered and pulsed with its own heartbeat. Through it, reality bent, showing glimpses of other places, other times. Valtor had spent years searching for this place, had sacrificed much to learn its location, and now he stood at its threshold with a being who might unmake everything the Force represented. The Sith turned to Darkseid, his mask reflecting the doorway's light. Once you pass through, you will be in a realm where the normal rules do not apply. The Mortis gods, if they still exist, are embodiments of the Force itself. The Father represents balance, the Son embodies the dark, the Daughter the light. They are not beings you can simply dominate. Darkseid walked past him without pause. Everything can be dominated. He stepped through the doorway, and the universe inverted. Mortis was a place of impossible geometry, where up and down were suggestions rather than laws, where time moved in spirals, and the sky was filled with monuments that floated without support. Darkseid stood on a platform of white stone that hung suspended above an endless drop, his eyes scanning the realm with methodical precision. The Force was stronger here, so strong it was almost visible, currents of light and dark swirling in eternal conflict. A voice spoke from everywhere and nowhere, ancient and sad. "You do not belong here, traveler. This place is for those who seek balance, not dominion." Darkseid turned and saw him then, the Father, an old man in simple robes whose eyes held the weight of eons. Beside him stood two others, a young woman radiating light so pure it hurt to look at directly, and a young man whose shadow seemed to extend in all directions at once. The Daughter and the Son, the embodiments of the Force's eternal duality. The Father stepped forward, his hands empty, his posture non-threatening but firm. "I know what you seek," he said. "I have seen it in the currents of what will be. You search for the anti-life equation, the formula to strip away free will and impose your singular vision upon all existence. But such a thing cannot exist here. The Force is life, and life requires choice." Darkseid's expression did not change. "Choice is an illusion," he said. "All beings follow patterns, act according to their nature. Free will is simply another name for predictable behavior dressed in the costume of dignity. The anti-life equation merely reveals this truth." The Daughter moved then, her voice gentle but unyielding. "You speak of truth, but you understand nothing. The Force connects all things, yes, but it does not control them. It offers paths, but the walker chooses which to take. That is the sacred gift of existence." The Son laughed, a sound like grinding stone. "Oh, sister, always so hopeful, but perhaps our visitor has a point. How many wars have been fought in the name of choice? How much suffering has free will produced? Maybe there is wisdom in his vision, a dark wisdom, but wisdom nonetheless." The Father raised a hand, and both his children fell silent. He looked at Darkseid with eyes that saw past armor and flesh, into the core of what the tyrant truly was. "You are not evil," he said slowly. "Evil requires passion, requires some twisted form of care about the outcome. You are beyond that. You are entropy given form, the heat death of meaning itself. And that is why you cannot be allowed to touch the Force's heart." Darkseid's eyes blazed. "You presume to deny me?" The Father's expression was infinitely sad. "I do not deny you. I simply remind you that even gods have limits, and this place is one of yours." The Omega effect erupted. Twin beams of annihilation lanced toward the Father, curving through the air with predatory intent. But before they could strike, the Daughter moved, her hand outstretched, and a shield of pure light materialized. The beams struck it and stopped, held in place by will alone, their energy crackling against the barrier like lightning trying to breach a storm wall. The Sun moved simultaneously, shadows coalescing into solid form, tendrils of darkness that lashed out toward Darkseid from a dozen angles. The tyrant spun, his movements faster than something his size should be capable of, and his fists caught the tendrils, tore them apart, scattered them like smoke. But more came, endless, relentless, the Darkseid itself given shape and purpose. The Father did not move, did not attack, but his presence filled the realm, a weight that pushed down on Darkseid like gravity, intensified 1,000-fold. The tyrant took a step forward, and it was like wading through crystallized time, every movement requiring the expenditure of incalculable energy. He took another step, then another, his will a battering ram against the metaphysical walls the father had erected. "You are strong," the father acknowledged, and his voice carried genuine respect, stronger than any who have come before. "But strength is not enough here. This place is balance made manifest, and balance cannot be broken by force alone." Darkseid reached the center of the platform and raised both hands. The Omega effect poured forth in a continuous stream, no longer targeting individuals but flooding the entire realm with destructive energy. The daughters' shields buckled and held. The son's shadows writhed and reformed. The father stood unmoved, his presence an anchor in the storm. For the first time in eons, Darkseid felt something approaching frustration. These beings were not gods as he understood them. They were concepts given form, ideas made flesh. One could not kill an idea, not with conventional means, but there were other ways. He stopped the assault and spoke, his voice cutting through the chaos with absolute clarity. "You speak of balance, Father, but your own existence proves the lie. You imprison your children here, force them to maintain an equilibrium neither wants. The son craves freedom in the dark, the daughter longs to spread light unchecked. You cage them both in the name of cosmic order. How is that different from what I offer? At least I am honest about the chains." The son's eyes flickered with sudden interest. "He speaks truth, Father. How long have we been here? How many cycles of the galaxy have turned while we remain frozen in this place, acting out your grand design?" The daughter's expression grew troubled. "Brother, do not listen to him. He twists words, seeks to divide us." But the seed was planted. Darkseid could see it in the son's posture, the way the young god's shadows coiled with barely restrained hunger. This was not a battle that would be won with the Omega effect. It would be won the way Darkseid had won 1,000 others, by finding the fault lines in his enemy's foundations and driving wedges into them until the structure collapsed. The father saw it too, saw the danger crystallizing before him. He turned to his son with an expression of profound sorrow. "I know you have questioned our purpose here," he said quietly. "I know you hunger for more than this endless vigil. But if you break the balance, if you allow yourself to be swayed by his promises, the galaxy will burn. Light and dark will war without end, and the force itself may be torn asunder." The son looked between his father and the armored god who stood radiating absolute certainty. In that moment, the entire realm seemed to hold its breath, waiting for a choice that would echo across realities. The son made his decision. He moved with the speed of thought, his form dissolving into pure darkness that flowed across the platform like oil. The shadows struck the father from behind, not to kill but to bind, wrapping around the old god's arms and legs, pinning him in place. The father gasped, more in sadness than pain, and the realm shuddered. "Brother, no," the daughter cried out, her light flaring bright enough to banish shadows for 100 meters. But the son's darkness was fueled by eons of resentment, of confinement, of watching a galaxy spiral through cycles of war and peace while he remained trapped in his role. Her light could not fully dispel it. Darkseid watched the siblings clash, their powers tearing at the fabric of Mortis itself, and he smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. He turned his attention to the father, bound and struggling against his own son's power, and he approached slowly. "You see," Darkseid said, his voice almost gentle. "Even here, in this place of supposed perfect balance, there is division, there is conflict. The Force does not bring peace, it simply provides more elegant ways to wage war. Give me what I seek, and I will end this. I will bring true order, the kind that does not require gods to enforce it." The father looked up at him, and there were tears on the old god's face. "You do not understand what you ask," he whispered. "The Force is not a tool, not a weapon, not a means to an end. It is the end itself, the eternal dance of creation and destruction, of growth and decay. To reduce it to an equation is to kill the very thing that makes existence meaningful." "Meaning," Darkseid replied, is the last refuge of the weak who cannot accept that they are nothing. He reached out with one hand, and his fingers found the father's chest. The Omega effect did not fire, did not explode in dramatic fury. Instead, it seeped, flowing from Darkseid's palm into the old god's body like poison into veins. The father screamed, a sound that shook Mortis to its foundations, and Darkseid began to see. He saw the Force's origin, saw the first spark of life igniting in a dead universe, saw how that spark had grown and spread and divided into light and dark, into creation and entropy. He saw the countless civilizations that had risen and fallen, each one adding their own interpretation to the Force's nature, shaping it even as it shaped them. He saw the Jedi and the Sith, two sides of the same failed philosophy, both seeking to control what should never be controlled. And beneath it all, hidden in the deepest currents of the Force's consciousness, he saw something else. A pattern, a mathematical structure. The skeleton of a universal constant that, if properly understood, could be translated into the language of the anti-life equation. He saw what he needed. Darkseid released the father and stepped back, his mind already processing the information, already beginning the calculations that would take decades to complete, but which he would complete nonetheless. The old god collapsed, his form flickering like a candle in wind, his power bleeding out into the realm itself. The daughter abandoned her battle with the sun and rushed to her father's side, her hands glowing with healing light. But the damage was done. Darkseid had not taken the father's life, but he had taken something more precious, the certainty that had kept the old god anchored through eons of duty. The father looked up at his daughter with eyes that had lost their focus. "I have failed," he whispered. "Balance is broken. The choice now falls to you, my children. Light or dark, order or chaos. I cannot hold the center anymore." The realm began to collapse. It did not happen all at once, but in stages, like a building whose supports had been compromised. The floating monuments cracked and fell. The white platform beneath them started to crumble. The sky itself split, revealing the howling chaos beyond. The space between spaces where the Force went when it had nowhere else to be. Darkseid walked to the edge of the dissolving platform and looked down into the abyss. He had what he came for. The rest was irrelevant. He stepped off the edge and fell, or perhaps rose, or perhaps simply moved in a direction that had no name, and the realm of Mortis fell away behind him. The sun stood over his father, his face twisted with emotions he could not name, triumph and guilt, and a terrible freedom he had never thought to possess. The daughter held her father's hand and wept, her tears falling like stars. And in the space between them, the balance that had held for millennia finally shattered, sending ripples through the Force that every sensitive being in the galaxy would feel as a disturbance, a wrongness, a sense that something fundamental had just broken and could never be repaired. Valtor felt it the moment Darkseid emerged from the Vergence. The Sith was still in the cavern, meditating, when the tyrant simply materialized beside him, stepping from nothing into sudden presence. The Force was screaming, a psychic wail that made Valtor's head pound and his vision blur. He looked at Darkseid and saw that the being's eyes were brighter now, burning with a knowledge that should not exist in any mortal mind. "What did you do?" Valtor asked, his voice hoarse. Darkseid began to walk toward the surface, each step echoing in the cavern like a judge's gavel. "I learned," he said simply, "and now the work begins." They emerged into the dead world's sky, and Darkseid paused, looking up at the stars. Somewhere out there, the Empire held sway over trillions. Somewhere out there, the rebellion fought its hopeless war. Somewhere out there, individuals made choices and believed those choices mattered. He would teach them differently. He would show them the truth written in the mathematics of the anti-life equation, rendered now in the language of the Force itself. But first, he needed time to complete the calculations, and time required space, and space required power. He would need to build an empire of his own, here in this galaxy, a foundation from which to launch the final conquest. And for that, he would need soldiers. He turned to Valtor. The Sith Lord was pale, shaking, clearly feeling the disturbance in the force but not understanding its source. Darkseid regarded him for a long moment, then spoke. "You will return to your Grand Admiral Thrawn," he said. "You will tell him I am ready to negotiate. He wishes to use me as a weapon against his enemies. I will allow this, for a time. In exchange, I require resources, worlds, and subjects. When I have gathered sufficient strength, I will complete my work, and this galaxy will kneel." Valtor wanted to refuse, wanted to ignite his lightsaber and strike this being down despite knowing it would be futile. But he was Sith, and the Sith understood power. He understood when one was beaten not by strength of arms but by sheer inevitability. He bowed his head. "As you command." They departed the Vergence world separately, Valtor in his ship, Darkseid through his own incomprehensible means of travel. Behind them, the cavern collapsed, the Vergence snuffed out like a candle flame, one more wound in the Force to add to the growing list. Above, in the world between worlds, the pathways that connected all times and all places began to flicker and fail, no longer anchored by the balance that Mortis had provided. And on 1,000 worlds, Jedi who had survived the Purge woke from nightmares they could not remember, their hands clutching at lightsabers that might no longer be enough. The second act of Darkseid's conquest began not with fire, but with whispers. Thrawn received Valtor's report and immediately saw the strategic value of what had occurred. A being of godlike power, fresh to this galaxy, lacking knowledge of its political structures and military capabilities, this was an asset that could be shaped, guided, used. The Grand Admiral drafted a proposal and transmitted it through channels known only to the highest echelons of Imperial intelligence. 3 days later, Darkseid received an invitation to a summit on Bastion, a fortress world in the Outer Rim that served as the Empire's secondary capital when Coruscant proved inconvenient. The invitation was phrased with exquisite care, acknowledging Darkseid's power while suggesting mutual benefit, offering alliance rather than demanding submission. It was the kind of diplomatic language Thrawn excelled at, words chosen to appeal to ego while disguising the trap beneath. Darkseid accepted, not because he trusted the Empire, but because their offer gave him exactly what he needed: legitimacy in the eyes of the galaxy's established powers, access to their industrial base, and time to complete his calculations without constant interruption from those who would seek to stop him before they understood what he truly represented. The summit took place in a conference chamber deep within Bastion's primary citadel, a room designed to intimidate with its sheer scale and the weight of Imperial iconography covering every surface. Thrawn stood at the head of a long table, flanked by generals and admirals whose service ribbons represented decades of warfare. At the far end, Darkseid sat in a chair that had been hastily reinforced to support his mass, his presence making the room feel smaller than it was. Grand Admiral Thrawn spoke first, his voice calm and measured, presenting his proposal as though discussing trade agreements rather than an alliance with a being who had already demonstrated the capacity to annihilate fleets. "The Empire seeks expansion into the unknown regions," he said. "Your arrival, while unexpected, represents an opportunity. You have power, we have infrastructure. You can crush resistance, we can consolidate control. Together, we could bring order to a chaotic galaxy." Darkseid listened without comment, his eyes fixed on Thrawn with the intensity of a predator assessing prey. When the Grand Admiral finished, the silence stretched for a full 30 seconds before the tyrant spoke. "You offer me nothing I could not take by force." "True," Thrawn acknowledged, unruffled. "But force requires energy, and energy requires time, and time is a resource even for beings of your considerable power. Why spend a decade conquering world by world when you could achieve the same result in a year through cooperation? The Empire provides structure, supply lines, administrative oversight. You provide the final word to those who would resist. It is efficient." Darkseid's expression did not change, but something in his posture shifted, a minute relaxation that those who knew him would recognize as assent. "Very well," he said. I will serve as your weapon, Grand Admiral, for a time, but understand this. When my work is complete, when I have decoded the fundamental truth of the Force and rendered it into the anti-life equation, all debts will be void. This galaxy, this reality, will be mine. Thrawn inclined his head slightly. Of course, he said, and those watching could not tell if he was humoring a madman or genuinely accepting the terms. Until that day comes, we have an accord. The alliance was formalized with all the bureaucratic weight the Empire could muster. Contracts and treaties that meant nothing to Darkseid, but which gave Thrawn the political cover to deploy the tyrant as he saw fit. Within a week, Darkseid was given command of a battle group consisting of 3 Star Destroyers and 50 smaller vessels, along with ground forces numbering in the tens of thousands. The Emperor himself, when informed of the arrangement, had laughed. A short, sharp sound transmitted across secure hollow channels, and then he had given his blessing. Let Thrawn play with his new toy, Palpatine said to Vader during one of their rare private conversations. If this Darkseid proves useful, we gain a weapon. If he proves troublesome, we will deal with him as we have dealt with all who overreach. Vader said nothing, but through the Force he felt something he had not felt in years, genuine unease. This being from beyond, this Darkseid, he was a void in the Force, a place where the Darkseid went to die. Even the Emperor, for all his power, registered as a presence, a nexus of hunger and ambition. But Darkseid was absence, entropy, the end of all things rendered animate. The Dark Lord of the Sith did not share these thoughts. He simply bowed and departed, his mind already turning over strategies for how to contain a threat neither lightsaber nor Force lightning could touch. Darkseid's first campaign under the Imperial banner targeted a cluster of systems in the Outer Rim that had declared independence shortly after the Battle of Yavin. They called themselves the Greldor Compact, a loose alliance of mining worlds and agricultural colonies that had decided they would rather starve free than prosper as slaves. They had fortified their positions, called in mercenaries, purchased outdated but functional warships from smugglers and black market dealers. They were prepared for a siege, prepared for orbital bombardment, prepared even for Vader. They were not prepared for Darkseid. The fleet arrived in the Greldor system and immediately launched a conventional assault. Star Destroyers advancing in formation, while TIE fighters screened for defensive emplacements. The compact forces engaged, their commanders confident that they could hold long enough for help to arrive from rebel contacts. They lasted 6 minutes. Darkseid did not remain on the flagship. The moment the battle began, he launched himself from the hangar bay, his body encased in the same dark sphere that allowed him to traverse the void, and he flew toward the largest of the defending stations. Point defense guns opened fire, turbo lasers tracking his approach, but the bolts that struck him simply dissipated against his will. He reached the station's hull and placed both hands against the metal. The Omega effect poured inward, not destroying the station but rewriting it, bending matter and energy into new configurations. Corridors sealed themselves. Bulkheads melted and reformed into walls. Life support systems shut down in some sections and intensified in others, and throughout the station, the garrison felt their bodies cease to obey, felt their limbs move without their minds commanding it, marching them to designated assembly points where they stood at attention and waited for their new purpose. It took Darkseid 7 minutes to convert the entire station. When he was done, 5,000 soldiers stood ready to serve, their faces blank, their eyes empty, their wills no longer their own. He had not killed them, death was wasteful. He had simply removed the part of them that could refuse. The process repeated across the system, station by station, world by world. The Star Destroyers served as transportation, ferrying Darkseid from one target to the next, while Imperial forces mopped up the scattered resistance that still possessed the capacity to fight. By the end of the first day, the Greldor Compact no longer existed as a political entity. By the end of the first week, its entire population was converted. 50 million souls transformed into extensions of Darkseid's will. Thrawn reviewed the reports from his quarters aboard the Chimera, and allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The conquest of Greldor had taken the Empire 3 years of planning and had been deemed too costly to execute. Darkseid had accomplished it in 7 days with minimal casualties on the Imperial side. The Grand Admiral began drafting orders for the next target, a rebel stronghold in the Mid-Rim that had resisted all conventional assaults. But in his private gallery, standing before his collection of alien artwork, Thrawn paused. Something about the Greldor reports troubled him, a detail in the descriptions of the converted populations. They still performed basic tasks, still operated machinery and maintained infrastructure, but they did so without innovation, without the capacity for independent thought that made sentient beings valuable. They were efficient, yes, but they were also hollow. Thrawn was not a man given to moral qualms. He had overseen the repeated destruction of entire civilizations in service to the Empire's expansion, but he understood the value of creativity and unpredictability. An army of the converted might win battles, but could it build something lasting? Could it govern? Could it adapt? He filed the question away for later consideration and returned to his tactical displays. For now, Darkseid was proving his worth. What came after could be addressed when the time arrived. Valtor watched from the shadows, both literally and metaphorically, as Darkseid carved his path through the Outer Rim. The Sith Lord did not participate in the battles directly. He was too valuable as an intelligence asset to risk exposure, but he observed through the Force, feeling the disturbances that followed in the tyrant's wake. And what he felt terrified him in ways he had not experienced since his first encounter with the dark side as a young acolyte. The Force was dying in the systems Darkseid touched. Not quickly, not obviously, but the connections that bound all living things were fraying, severed by the conversion process. 50 million minds removed from the Force's web, 50 million futures erased from the tapestry of possibility. And with each erasure, the fabric grew thinner, weaker, more prone to catastrophic failure. Valtor had served the dark side for decades, had killed Jedi and innocents alike in pursuit of power and knowledge, but he had always understood that his actions were part of a larger cycle. Light and dark, growth and decay, the eternal dance that gave meaning to existence. What Darkseid represented was not decay but stagnation, not entropy but the cessation of all change. It was the opposite of everything the Force stood for. The Sith made a decision that would have shocked any who knew his history. He reached out through encrypted channels to a contact he had maintained since before the Empire, a former Jedi who had survived the Purge by abandoning her connection to the Force and hiding in the slums of Nar Shaddaa. Her name was Ilara Vosk, and she had once been a sentinel, a guardian of the balance, before the galaxy went mad. The message was brief: meet me on Dantooine. Coordinates attached. Come alone. What I have to tell you will save or damn us all. Ilara received the message with suspicion. Valtor was known to her as a monster, a Sith who had personally killed 3 of her friends during the Purge, but the urgency in the transmission's subtext suggested desperation. She debated for a full day, then gathered her few possessions and booked passage on a freighter heading toward the Outer Rim. They met in the ruins of the old Jedi enclave on Dantooine, a place that still resonated with echoes of the light despite decades of abandonment. Valtor stood among the broken columns, his mask reflecting the twin suns' light, and Ilara approached with her hand resting on the hilt of a blaster she had carried since leaving the Order. "You have courage, coming here," the Sith said, his voice softer than she expected. "Or perhaps desperation. I know what you think of me, Ilara. I know the blood on my hands. But set that aside for a moment and listen." He told her everything. About Darkseid's arrival, about the destruction of the Chiss fleet, about the journey to Mortis and the breaking of the Father. He described the converted populations in the Outer Rim, the slow death of the Force in those regions, and the tyrant's ultimate goal of completing the anti-life equation using the Force itself as the final component. When he finished, Ilara was pale, her hand no longer on her blaster but gripping the edge of a broken pillar for support. "If what you say is true," she whispered, "then the Force itself is in danger. Not just the Jedi, not just the light, but the fundamental energy that binds the galaxy. Valtor nodded slowly. I have walked the dark paths for so long I had forgotten what it means to fear. But I fear this, Ilara. I fear what he will become if he completes his work. The galaxy will not fall. It will simply cease to mean anything. Every choice, every struggle, every moment of growth or sacrifice rendered null by mathematical proof. Ilara straightened, her training as a sentinel reasserting itself despite the years. What do you propose? The Jedi are scattered, the Sith serve the Emperor, and this Darkseid has the backing of the Empire's military. Who can stand against that? We can, Valtor said. Not in open battle, we would be destroyed in moments. But there are other ways to fight: sabotage, misdirection, exploiting the one weakness he possesses. And what weakness is that? Ilara asked. His certainty, the Sith replied. Darkseid believes he has already won, that his victory is inevitable. That makes him predictable. And predictability, in a galaxy as chaotic as ours, is a liability. They talked through the night, a Sith and a former Jedi, plotting rebellion not against the Empire or the Darkseid, but against something far more fundamental. By dawn, they had the outline of a plan, fragile and desperate, but possible. They would need allies, resources, and above all time. Time to find the converted and attempt to reverse the process. Time to locate other Force sensitives who might understand the metaphysical threat. Time to discover if the damage to Mortis could be repaired before the Force's balance collapsed entirely. It was not much, but it was a beginning. As they parted, Ilara turned back to look at the Sith Lord. Why, she asked, why betray your alliance with Darkseid? Why risk everything to stop him? Valtor was silent for a long moment, then removed his mask for the first time in years. Beneath it, his face was scarred, aged beyond his years, but his eyes were clear. Because I am Sith, he said quietly. And the Sith exist to test the Darkseid, to push it to its limits and see what it can become. But there is no Darkseid without light, no conflict without choice. Darkseid would end that. He would end everything. And a Sith without a galaxy to conquer is just a relic waiting for death. He replaced his mask and walked away, vanishing into the ruins. Ilara watched him go, then activated her comlink and began making calls to every surviving Jedi she knew, every Force sensitive in hiding, every soul who might understand what was coming and be willing to stand against it. The resistance began that day, small and scattered, a handful of individuals against an empire and a god. But galaxies had been saved by less. 3 months into the campaign, Darkseid's calculations reached their halfway point. He worked in solitude, deep within the fortress he had constructed on Nestig, surrounded by holocrons and data cores pillaged from a dozen civilizations. The mathematics were staggering in their complexity, equations that spanned dimensions and required him to invent entirely new forms of notation just to express the relationships he was discovering. The Force, he had learned, was not singular, but fractal, repeating patterns of connection and division that operated at every scale from the quantum to the cosmic. To translate it into the anti-life equation required breaking it down to its most fundamental components, stripping away the mythology and sentiment, revealing the cold mechanical truth beneath. He was close. So close he could taste it, a certainty that sat on his tongue like copper. Another 3 months, perhaps 4, and he would have it. The final proof, the ultimate tool. But completion required one more component, something he had not anticipated needing. The Force, for all its power, lacked true consciousness. It was vast and it was reactive, but it was not sapient, not in the way a mind was sapient. To render it into the anti-life equation, he needed to infuse his calculations with a living will, a Force sensitive of sufficient strength to serve as the bridge between the mathematical and the metaphysical. He had considered using Faltor, but the Sith was too wary, too prone to independent thought. He needed someone broken, someone whose will had already been shattered and remade in desperation. And the galaxy, conveniently, had just such an individual. Darkseid transmitted a message to Thrawn, a request rather than a demand, phrased with uncharacteristic diplomacy. He required an audience with Darth Vader. The Grand Admiral raised an eyebrow at the request, but forwarded it to Coruscant with a note suggesting it might be in the Empire's interest to humor their ally. Vader arrived on Nesthig 1 week later, his Star Destroyer settling into orbit while the Dark Lord descended alone to the surface. He walked through Darkseid's fortress, past converted soldiers who stood at attention with empty eyes, past chambers filled with machinery that hummed with energies he could not identify through the Force, until he stood before the tyrant's throne. The two regarded each other in silence, God and fallen Jedi, each measuring the other's power and finding it vast in different ways. Finally, Vader spoke, his respirator turning each word into a mechanical growl. "You wish to speak with me?" Darkseid inclined his head slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement rather than respect. "I have studied your history, Darth Vader. Anakin Skywalker, the Chosen One, who was prophesied to bring balance to the Force, but instead brought ruin. You were powerful once, before the flames took your body and the dark side took your soul. Now you serve the Emperor, a slave in all but name." Vader's hand moved to his lightsaber but did not draw it. "Choose your next words carefully." Darkseid smiled, a terrible expression. "I offer you freedom," he said. "Not from the Emperor, though that would be a pleasant side effect. Freedom from choice itself, from the burden of decisions that haunt you across decades. You live in pain, both physical and spiritual, tormented by memories of what you were and what you have become. I can end that. I can give you certainty. The memories of comment, peace that comes from knowing there is only one path, and you walk it because you must, not because you chose." The Dark Lord was silent for a long time, his breathing the only sound in the chamber. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer, almost vulnerable. "You offer oblivion, extinction of the self. I offer truth," Darkseid countered. "The truth that choice is meaningless, that suffering serves no purpose, that the only rational response to existence is surrender to inevitable order. Your Emperor promises power, but power requires maintenance, requires constant struggle to keep what you have gained. I promise something better, rest." Vader turned away, his cape swirling. "I did not come here to be converted. State your actual purpose, or I depart." Darkseid leaned back in his throne, satisfied. He had not expected to turn Vader with words alone. That had simply been a test, a way to understand the depth of the Sith Lord's brokenness. What he had learned was sufficient. Vader was indeed shattered, but the pieces were held together by will alone, by a stubborn refusal to fully surrender even to the dark side. That made him useless for Darkseid's purposes, but it also made him predictable. "Very well," Darkseid said. "I wish to meet you because you represent this galaxy's greatest warrior, and I would know if you could be an obstacle to my goals. Now I have my answer. You are formidable, Lord Vader, but you are not what I require. You may inform your Emperor that our alliance continues as agreed." Vader regarded him for a moment longer, then departed without another word. He walked back through the fortress, past the converted, and something in what he saw made him pause. These were not droids, not programmed automata. They were people, still breathing, still technically alive, but robbed of the one thing that made life worth living: the capacity to choose. The Dark Lord had committed atrocities beyond counting, had slaughtered younglings and betrayed everyone who ever trusted him, but he had always possessed agency. He had chosen his path, even if that choice was born from fear and manipulation. These converted had no such luxury. For the first time in decades, Darth Vader felt something approaching doubt, not about his power or his loyalty to the Emperor, but about the nature of the enemy he had just met. Darkseid was not a rival to be defeated or a rebel to be crushed. He was something else entirely, a force that could not be opposed through conventional means. Vader returned to his ship and immediately transmitted an encrypted message to Palpatine. The message was brief: "This being is a threat beyond our current capacity to contain. Recommend observation and contingency preparation." The Emperor read the message and laughed again. but this time the sound carried an edge of genuine interest. Perhaps, he mused to himself, it is time to test our new ally's limits. After all, the best way to understand a weapon is to see it break. The trap was sprung on the world of Kerev Doi, a fortress planet in the corporate sector that had recently been absorbed into the Empire's expanding territory. Intelligence reports suggested the rebellion had established a hidden base there, using the planet's extensive cave systems to shield their operations from orbital scans. Thrawn had been planning a conventional assault, drop troopers and AT-ATs, to root out the insurgents, when the Emperor intervened with new orders. "Send Darkseid," Palpatine commanded. "Let us see how he handles an enemy that knows he is coming." The trap was elegant in its simplicity. The rebels on Kerev Doi were not actually rebels at all. They were mercenaries hired through cutouts, equipped with experimental weapons designed by Imperial research divisions, and briefed extensively on Darkseid's tactics and capabilities. They had force pikes modified to disrupt energy fields, sonic weapons calibrated to the frequencies most likely to cause discomfort to beings of immense mass, and, most crucially, they had been given access to a small cache of cortosis, the rare mineral that could short out lightsabers and, in theory, disrupt other energy-based systems. Darkseid arrived on Kerev Doi with his usual directness, descending from orbit in his personal energy sphere, flanked by a battalion of converted soldiers. He touched down outside the primary cave entrance and immediately encountered the first line of resistance, fortified positions manned by mercenaries in heavy armor who opened fire the moment he came into range. The blaster bolts were deflected as expected, but then the sonic weapons activated, massive cone-shaped devices that flooded the area with subsonic pulses designed to vibrate matter at its resonant frequency. Darkseid felt it, a discomfort that registered not as pain but as wrongness, a disruption of his physical cohesion. He raised his hand, and the Omega effect lanced out, but the beams struck shields that flickered and held, cortosis-laced barriers that disrupted the energy's coherence. For the first time since arriving in this galaxy, Darkseid had to exert effort. He advanced step by step, his converted soldiers moving ahead of him, absorbing fire and falling in droves. The mercenaries were good, better than average, and their equipment was designed specifically to counter his advantages. It took him 20 minutes to breach the first defensive line, and by the time he did, he had lost a third of his forces. Inside the caves, the resistance intensified. The passages were narrow, limiting his mobility, and the mercenaries had rigged the walls with explosives that brought down tons of rock at calculated intervals. Darkseid blasted through each obstacle with the Omega effect, but the energy expenditure was beginning to add up. He was not tired, not in any conventional sense, but he was aware that his resources were finite, that even his vast power could be depleted through sustained effort. The Emperor watched through remote sensors, hidden holocams that fed real-time data back to Coruscant. He sat in his throne room, fingers steepled, and smiled as Darkseid fought his way deeper into the caves. "Yes," he murmured to the empty air, "you are powerful, but you are not invincible. Every god has limits, and I have just begun to learn yours." Vader stood beside his master, observing the feed with his arms crossed. "He will adapt," the Dark Lord said. "Each obstacle teaches him, makes him more efficient. This trap will slow him but not stop him." Palpatine's smile widened. "I know, my friend, but slow is all I need. Slow gives me time to study, to prepare. And when the moment comes, when this Darkseid completes his anti-life equation and believes himself supreme, I will show him what true power looks like." On Kerev Doi, Darkseid reached the heart of the cave complex and found the final surprise waiting for him. Not mercenaries, not weapons, but a singular figure standing in the center of a vast chamber. She was human, or had been once, her body augmented with cybernetics that glowed with sickly green light. She wore the tattered robes of a Jedi, and in her hand was a lightsaber whose blade flickered between colors, unstable and raw. Her name was Kira Sen, and she had been a Padawan once, before the Empire rose. She had survived Order 66 by hiding in the lower levels of Coruscant, had witnessed her master's death at Vader's hand, and had spent the years since consumed by a single purpose: revenge against those who had destroyed the Jedi. When Imperial agents approached her with an offer, a chance to strike at someone who threatened the Force itself, she had accepted without hesitation. The augmentations they gave her had cost her humanity, but they had also given her power. Her cybernetic limbs were laced with cortosis. Her nervous system was hardwired to a force amplifier, a device that boosted her connection to the light side at the cost of burning out her lifespan. She had perhaps an hour left to live, and she intended to make it count. Darkseid regarded her with something that might have been curiosity. "You are a warrior," he said. "I can see it in your stance, in the way you hold that weapon. But you are also dying. Your body is consuming itself from within. Why throw away what little time you have left?" Kira ignited her lightsaber, the blade settling into a brilliant white. "Because some things are worth dying for," she said quietly. "The Force is one of them." She moved. The battle that followed was brief but apocalyptic in its intensity. Kira was not a master duelist. She had never completed her training. But the Force amplifier gave her speed and strength beyond anything a normal human could possess. She closed the distance in a blur, her blade slashing at Darkseid's throat, his eyes, his joints, seeking any weakness. The tyrant caught her wrist mid-swing, and the cortosis in her arm flared, disrupting the energy field around his gauntlet. He released her and stepped back, reassessing. The Omega effect fired and Kira dodged, using the Force to predict the beam's trajectory a split second before they manifested. She rolled, came up slashing, and her blade connected with Darkseid's chestplate. Cortosis met whatever unearthly metal composed his armor, and there was a sound like reality tearing, a shriek of energies incompatible trying to occupy the same space. Darkseid staggered, actually staggered, and Kira pressed the advantage. She was everywhere and nowhere, a phantom of light and fury, her blade leaving trails of white fire in the air. She struck his shoulder, his leg, his face, each impact accompanied by that terrible tearing sound. And for the first time, Darkseid felt something he had not felt in eons. Not pain, not exactly, but damage. Actual, quantifiable damage to his physical form. He roared, a sound that shook the cave and brought down stalactites from the ceiling, and he unleashed the Omega effect in all directions simultaneously. The beams filled the chamber, crisscrossing and rebounding off the walls, turning the space into a death trap of annihilation. Kira's augmented reflexes kept her alive for 5 seconds, 10, 15. But no one, not even one empowered by the Force, could dodge forever. A beam caught her leg, and she fell, her cybernetics sparking. Another hit her chest and she screamed, the Force amplifier overloading, feedback burning through her nervous system like acid. She tried to rise, failed, and looked up to see Darkseid standing over her, his armor scorched and dented but still intact. "You fought well," he said, and there might have been respect in his voice. But courage without power is simply tragedy prolonged. He raised his hand and Kira closed her eyes, reaching out through the Force one last time. She did not reach for help or salvation. She reached for memory, for the feeling of her master's presence in those last moments before Vader's blade fell, for the certainty that even in defeat, even in death, she had mattered. The Omega effect descended, and Kira Sen joined the Force. Darkseid stood alone in the chamber, surrounded by rubble and the bodies of the converted soldiers who had fallen during the assault. He looked down at his armor, at the scorch marks and the small cracks where Kira's blade had found purchase. Damage. Repairable, negligible in the grand scheme, but undeniable. The Empire had tested him and learned valuable information. So had he. He turned and walked back through the caves, his mind already processing the encounter, cataloging weaknesses and developing countermeasures. By the time he reached the surface, he had formulated a new requirement for his fortress defenses, cortosis scanners and energy baffles to neutralize sonic weapons. The Emperor's trap had taught him what he needed to learn. But Palpatine's observation had also taught the Sith Emperor what he needed to know. Darkseid could be wounded, which meant, given sufficient preparation and resources, he could perhaps be killed. The war entered a new phase then, one of shadow and misdirection, as three factions maneuvered against one another. The Empire sought to use Darkseid as a weapon while preparing contingencies for his eventual betrayal. Valtor and Ilara's resistance worked to reverse the conversion process and locate any means of restoring the balance to the Force. And Darkseid himself, oblivious or indifferent to the schemes around him, continued his calculations, creeping ever closer to the completion of the anti-life equation rendered in the language of this galaxy's fundamental power. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not just the fate of the Empire or the rebellion, but the nature of existence itself. And in the shadows between stars, something stirred, a presence that had been watching since the moment the sky first tore open. It had no name in any language spoken by mortals. It was simply the Force itself, awakening to defend what Darkseid sought to destroy. The galaxy held its breath, unaware that the choice between freedom and oblivion hung in the balance, waiting for a single moment of perfect clarity to tip the scales one way or the other.